Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. Today we're going to get an update from Dr. Stanley Goldfarb, the founder of Do No Harm, which has been fighting the woke takeover of hospitals and the medical profession for about 5 years now. Dr. Goldfarb is the author of Take Two Aspirin and Call Me By My Pronouns, Why Turning Doctors into Social Justice Warriors is Destroying American Medicine. Do No Harm has filed dozens of complaints with the U.S. Office of Civil Rights charging violations of Title VI and Title IX, including one in 2023, stating that the University of Texas at San Antonio's Long School of Medicine's Diversity in Medicine Visiting Elective Scholars Program, they always have these really long names, barred whites and Asians from applying. That same year, they released a report entitled The Progressive Takeover of Texas Medical Schools. Dr. Goldfarb is the former Associate Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, and he's been the Paul Revere on how medical schools have been infiltrated by woke policies all across America, including here in Texas. Since the last time we talked, Texas has passed the toughest anti-DEI legislation targeting higher education in the country. And, of course, President Trump is shutting down DEI programs as fast as he can. I'm anxious to hear the latest efforts of Do No Harm. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Goldfarb.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you. Wonderful to be in Texas, too.
Well, absolutely. It all comes out of here. We were shutting down DEI even before Trump was elected, and it caused quite a stir at the university. But what we learned was that we were just skimming off the law. What are you learning? I saw a recent report that you did on medical schools where you found that 75% of the hiring of faculty required a DEI statement. Why don't you explain what that is?
Yes, actually, the source of that came about because we did a Freedom of Information Act to one of the medical schools in Ohio, and because it turned out that the AAMC, which is the trade group of American medical schools, put out a request. It was sort of a dashboard of all the DEI activities that any school could possibly be involved in. Turns out that 75% of medical schools were in the positive range on all of these DEI requirements, specifically the requirement you mentioned where faculty members had to pledge that they not only supported DEI activities, but had actively engaged in various social justice activities and supporting various DEI initiatives in order to get either hired or promoted onto the faculty of the various medical schools. So what they really were doing there was demanding some sort of ideological purity on the part of the people that were going to teach medical students. And again, the overall goal here is to create advocates for various social justice issues rather than doing anything that's going to help the care of patients, which is really what the medical students are there for. So this turns out to be just one of several DEI initiatives that are present in the vast majority of medical schools in the country, maybe even all of them when all is said and done. This is our goal. Our goal is to eliminate these simply because we think that it detracts from what really should be going on in medical schools, which is teaching students to take care of sick patients. That's really what it's about.
What drives all this? Is it federal funding? Is it the DEI ideology that's in the university separate from the medical school? Is it a belief? I mean, we talked before about there are some people that firmly believe that minority patients are best treated by minority doctors. I live in San Antonio. I don't think I've got any Anglo doctors.
Yeah.
Most of the people that treat me are Hispanic or Indian. So, what is driving it, or is it all of those things?
Yeah, no, I think it is all of those things. But it becomes, on one hand, sort of a sociologic exploration to find out what the roots of all this really are. And there are various sort of social philosophers who have different ideas. Some of them, James Lindsay, for example, famously thinks this is all Marxist in its origin, but it doesn't necessarily have an economic component to it. If you go back to to the time after World War II, there was after Europe was destroyed and there was sort of a reemergence of Western civilization after the war, there was a question of how they were going to build healthcare systems. And certain social philosophers, even Illich, famous one, a Catholic priest, who spoke strongly against sort of advanced medicine and advocated for much more public health as the role of healthcare. And it got into not training physicians to take care of really sick people, but training physicians to be sort of public health workers. That was kind of the origin of it. And therefore, social justice came in because the belief was if you improve the social conditions of a community, you wouldn't stamp out all disease, but you would improve the general health of the community. That was kind of the basis for it. But then around the turn of the century, around the
And
year,
that's not totally untrue.
it's not. I mean, there's a strong relationship between social conditions and health, but exactly what the biological basis for that is isn't clear. So, for example, just because you live in a neighborhood that has violence doesn't mean you're going to have disease. What it does tend to mean is that the people who live in those communities, for whatever reason, poor education, difficulty finding all of the facilities they need to let them work effectively, a lot of family breakup, a lot of community violence and all prevents them from accessing the healthcare system. And often the educational system hasn't given them the wherewithal to really be able to understand when they have symptoms to access the healthcare system early. They often wait too long. So that's the kind of link between poor community conditions and poor health outcomes, as opposed to when they get to the hospital, they get to the physician, they're being treated in a discriminatory manner by the physicians. That's kind of been the underlying premise about forcing physicians to take implicit bias training and so on. But let me return to the question you had about the racial concordance, because I think this is a really important issue. And what I mean by that is this idea that Black patients need to have Black doctors to have the best health outcomes. If somebody decides they want to go and look at what these various organizations that promote more diversity in medicine use as the rationale, this is a key rationale. And on the surface, you say, oh, yeah, that sort of makes sense. And I've seen some very intelligent people say, yeah, I'm sure that's true, but it isn't true. And why I can say that it isn't true is because there actually is a very robust medical literature on this question. It's been asked many, many times over the last 20 or 30 years. Because if it is true, that does give a very good rationale for diversity programs in medicine. If it isn't true, it totally undermines their argument. So how can I say that it isn't true? Well, it turns out amongst the 60 or so studies of this issue, there have been 5 systematic reviews. And systematic reviews are very rigorous studies that are conducted and published. These are all published in the medical literature. And each of these systematic reviews basically shows that there is no benefit to having a Black doctor treat a Black patient. For example, if you ask the question, what about communication? Do Black patients communicate better with Black physicians compared to white physicians? There are about 50 studies of this. A few of them show it's beneficial. More than a few, 8 of them actually show that it's actually worse if a Black patient has a Black doctor, and the others show no difference whatsoever. And when you think about it, that sort of makes sense because it assumes that the Black community is a uniform identity, that all Black patients have the same values, which is obviously ridiculous on the surface of it. And it also assumes that all Black doctors are going to be particularly attuned to the Black community. Some Black doctors have their origins in Africa. Actually, in Africa, they're African immigrants that have come here, and some of them are people that have come from very high upper class, very wealthy families. There's no particular reason that these relationships would hold simply because of race. So it turns out that the literature doesn't support this idea. And then lastly, I would just say that if you query Black patients, and we've done this, our organization, Do No Harm, has done this, and ask the question, what do Black patients want? Do they want Black doctors or not? So if you ask them, do you want a Black doctor, someone that looks like you, or do you want the best doctor available, no matter what their race is? And they will say, I want the best doctor. And there's one other point about this racial concordance that's a big problem, and that is, think about a brilliant young Black student who wants to be a physician, gets into medical school, is enormously successful, gets into the best training programs, goes out and starts his or her career, and yet people will point to them, and we know that this is occurring, and say, well, the only reason they're there is because they had a benefit because of their race, when in fact their achievements have now been undermined by this kind of racialism that goes into, picking who's going to get to be a physician. So for all these reasons, it doesn't really help Black patients. Black patients really don't want this, and it undermines the careers that physicians who really have performed remarkably well. It undermines their career and it takes away the honor that they should be accorded because of their achievements. This is a really a bad idea for American medicine. And just imagine that if we let it go, let's say it's okay. Let's have Black doctors take care of Black patients. Do we want white patients to come in and say, I only want white doctors? Do we want Black patients to come in and say, I only want white doctors? We don't want racialism.
Women only want
we
women.
don't want this. We want to have a colorblind nation. That was Martin Luther King's goal. That's the goal of my organization. We want to make sure the best doctors, and I couldn't care if all of the students at the University of San Antonio, University of Texas at San Antonio Medical School were minority students. If they were the best people available, wonderful. That should be the determinant, their merit and not anything else.
It seems like there's so many factors there. Communications with doctors is a big thing. Patient-doctor communication. I mean, that's something that a code that many people have not yet cracked, But I think about the firemen, that ridiculous thing we saw in California where the fireman comes out and says, yes, if I'm coming in to rescue you from a fire, you're going to feel better if it's somebody that looks like you. No, you're just going to feel good that somebody is rescuing you. So tell me about recruitment and scores. I'm very interested. One of the things that we do here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we're working very hard to pass education savings accounts to give school choice to students. And one of the reasons that we want to do that is throughout half the state, many of our students are not doing math anywhere near grade level. And of course, those numbers are much worse in minority schools. So but then we're looking at med school. I mean, it's no surprise. The same thing is true with engineering. It's no surprise to me that we don't have a lot of minority students enrolled in engineering when we only got about 10% of our minority students statewide that can do basic math. I mean, this is not a surprise. So how do they jigger the scores?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like we've got to fix the basic education. We can't fix those things at the college level.
Yes, well, I think that's absolutely. First, to address the point you just made, I was on a television show, the Dr. Phil Show with Dr. Ben Carson, who gives a beautiful discussion of how if we want to fix this problem of various minority groups not performing well enough or equal to some other groups that are applying, for example, to medical school, and I'll come back to that in a moment, that we need to fix it at the elementary school level. We need to fix it at that point. Trying to fix it later on by altering the criteria for accepting people into medical school, which is what's gone on, it's a mistake, because we know, for example, that if you look at individuals whose MCAT, which is the achievement test for medical school, if you take people in whose scores are lower than the average, which is what happens, a Black student who has scores below the average has something like an 80% chance still of getting into medical school compared to an Asian student who has about a 10% chance if they have scores below average. And in medical education, we know that there are 22,000 openings for medical students in this country, in medical schools. There are over 55,000 students who are applying to medical school. So, it's unlike undergraduate, it's probably unlike engineering schools. If you're not accepted at medical school, you're not going to get to be a physician unless you decide to go to another country, the Caribbean, and so on. So it really is a zero-sum game. So there's a question here of fairness as well, and it's not just a question of getting into an elite school, it's getting into any medical school. If there's a particular racial basis for choosing students compared to their academic performance, there's going to be real unfairness. And we know that the Asian students are rejected, just like we saw the story at Harvard and University of North Carolina that the Supreme Court said could not be sustained, should stop. We're seeing the same thing in medical schools. It's much harder for a South Asian kid to get into medical school than it is for a black kid, even though the South Asian kid may be performing much better. And when we look at the performance in medical school, it does track very well with how well you do on the MCAT scores. Students who have lower MCAT scores are weaker students. And not only that, we know that when those weaker students go into residency programs, which are also chosen in part based on some racial issues in many schools, there's a push for diversity in the training of neurologists or neurosurgeons or plastic surgeons or what have you. When we look at the performance of those students in those training programs, and we have two large studies that are published in the medical literature on this. One was published in the Journal of the American Medical Colleges. It's called Academic Medicine, and another was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Two very large studies showed that the resident trainees post-medical school, the minority students are doing less well. They're graded by their faculty members as being less proficient in medical knowledge, in professionalism, and in readiness to go out and practice as they're finishing their careers in training. So we are sacrificing quality. Now, again, it's not to say that there aren't some brilliant and high achieving minority kids in these training programs, but as a group, their performance is less good. And ultimately, this plays out into individuals who are going to be less effective as physicians. So I always say that what we really need to think about when we think about who gets the chance to practice medicine, we need to think about the school and the student, what's good for them, but we also need to think about the patient. So there are three people in the discussion of who should get into medical school, not just the school and the student and who gets that opportunity.
Well, there's so much depth. One of the things that you've uncovered in your 5 years of being Paul Revere is when you first began seeing this, and you looked at it in curriculum, and you looked at it in faculty, and you looked at it in testing and the selection of students, is that, and we found this in DEI in every aspect of higher education, is that it's at every level of the system. And we're seeing, Trump today went after DEI in the military. He's gone after DEI in higher ed. He's pulling grants. But still, how do you see this unraveling? And you've got proposals that I want to talk about for legislation in Texas. We have some more proposals. How does this get unraveled in our lifetimes? Because it's taken 20, 30 years to put it together.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, it's in some sense, it's asking how do you unravel a cult? How do you unravel a political philosophy? It's probably going to be impossible to get rid of the idea that this is a good thing, that diversity, equity, and inclusion regimens are good things for schools. But I think, unfortunately, this is one of these examples where the government has to step in. It has to control funding. And, education and healthcare are primarily administered at the state level. And this is why our organization, Do No Harm, has been so active in various states trying to promote legislation, because the legislation is linked to the purse strings, and the federal efforts are also linked to the purse strings. So, but the support of state schools comes through state legislatures. And if the state legislator says you can't spend money on these issues, and they're going to be able to audit this fairly carefully, I think that will make a big difference. But the idea, unfortunately, we're a divided country. People believe that these ideas are the right ideas. They haven't been willing to confront the reality of their ideas, the data that I described earlier that shows that their ideas are simply wrong. And we haven't reached a point in time where the problem with education in the minority communities is so weak that the qualified individuals are not forthcoming into these programs, and we're having to lower standards in order to achieve these diversity quotas that really have been put in place. So I think it will be to get rid of the DEI infrastructure. That really is the efforts that our organization, the federal government, is now working on. Get rid of the ways we pay for these DEI offices. And ultimately, that will reduce this activity to a much lower level than it exists right now. But, again, people are true believers in this. For example, I just saw the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Organization, had a graphic of their leadership. And they had a woman who was their chief diversity officer. And after the president's order came out, they changed the graphic. She's still there. Her picture's still there. Her name is still there, but they changed her to senior executive. So are they just going to change the names but maintain the programs? If they do that, the audits are going to have to take place. Lawsuits will have to take place. And this will have to be finally adjudicated, maybe in the courts, or the legislatures being able to control the funding in very detailed ways and get it under control that way. But I'm afraid American life is going to be fighting this for many years to come, but we're devoted to a marathon, and we're not going to give up because of that.
Well, and it's not the good news for us is that it's not an American core belief. They would have you think, the diversity officers and the senior diversity officers, that this is something that America wants. But all of our polling in Texas, we ask at our universities, and we ask this, in a non-biased way, do you think that there should be special programs for African Americans, Hispanics, and gay people to make sure that they fit in? Or do you think everyone should be treated the same? 70-30. Everybody should be treated the same. Mm-hmm. And then Rasmussen just came out last week with polling on DEI questions. And people don't fully understand DEI, so it's hard to poll. Mm-hmm. But they do not like the idea of special treatment. So it's not like we're coming up against college football or apple pie or something that Americans have a core belief. I mean, one of my favorite exercises that is causing you problems and our organization is to visit the website of the National Association of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officers in Higher Education. Their mission is to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion officers in higher education. You can hardly tell what they're up against. So they're pushing for more people. You guys did a little bit of work, and I was interested in this on Medicare because I'm on Medicare, and the forms have really changed. I sprained my wrist, and I was just in an office yesterday, and I had to answer 2 questions about my gender. Was I this? I just crossed them all out, But is the doctor does the doctor need to prove that he's treating any non-binary person that comes in there? I mean, is that, how has this infiltrated Medicare and other government medicine programs?
It's a very interesting question because, there is an American value of letting people live the lives the way they want to live.
Sure.
And so as far as my organization is concerned, we have taken on a gender issue, but have remained steadfast in opposing any kind of a transition for children. Any child that decides they want to change their body with hormones and surgeries and even social transitioning, we feel is a great mistake, a grave mistake for a child, because they need to be able to go through their puberty and then decide what kind of lives they want to live. Now, once they become adults, they have a right to live the life. If they want to dress, if a man wants to put on a dress, that's really their business. However, my personal view now here is that, nobody should be compelled to look at that person and say, well, that's a woman. They're not. There are 2 sexes. There's males and there's females. People want to dress the way they want. That's their business. But they're not changing the basic biology. And to say that they're women is, I think, just silly. On the other hand, the people who want to call themselves women have a perfect right to live that life and to be respected. And I would say that when I was the associate dean for curriculum at Penn, we had a transgender health day because transgender people are going to come to the doctor. They need care. Mm-hmm. They have some unique medical problems, most of which have been created by physicians who gave them medications that have harmed their bodies, and sometimes even surgical procedures that have harmed their bodies. But we had to deal with it as physicians, and the students that we were training had to deal with it. So my view is we should certainly not compel people to speak in a way that they don't want to speak. If they don't want to call someone a woman who's a man who decides that they're going to either take medications to make themselves more feminine looking or wear clothes, that basically nobody should be compelled to say that, that's the way I must speak. They can choose to speak that way. They can choose to decide they're going to call their patients by any pronoun the patient wants. I personally don't mind that, because to me, when a patient comes to me, it's my job to take care of them, not my job to judge them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the way physicians should act. But they shouldn't be compelled. They shouldn't lose their job if they decide they're not going to call people by a specific name that they want to be called, when we know that doesn't reflect the reality of their existence. So
right.
That's my view of it. But children, we feel absolutely firm about that they should be spared these gender transition treatments because, and let me just say for the audience a couple of reasons. The biggest one is children can't possibly make this decision. Anybody who has children, who knows children, knows they change their minds all the time. To have a young girl's breasts removed because she decides that she wants to look more like a boy is at the age of 15 or 16, the way Chloe Cole, someone whom we work with, a famous so-called detransitioner, it's almost criminal, really. It isn't legally, officially criminal, but it certainly, one could make a good, strong case that it's ethically wrong, and certainly medically, there's no evidence that it benefits these children. And so, we're just steadfast that this is a terrible mistake, because children can't possibly understand what they're doing to the rest of their lives when they're 14 or 15 or 16 years old and making such a decision. And of course, the other problem is the medical evidence doesn't support that it benefits them. They're very troubled to begin with, and these procedures don't really relieve the psychological difficulties and vulnerabilities that they have.
Is this typical for, and it gets stronger all the time. The Europeans have really rolled back their use of puberty blockers and cross-sex gender surgeries. They're very clear. They're moving much more towards talk therapy in terms of dealing with gender dysphoria. But the U.S. just seems to be ignoring that, just dogmatically ignoring it.
Yeah, it's terrible. In the New England Journal, which has always been held up as sort of the Bible of American medical journals, the most prestigious and important one, they had an essay in there the other day by two physicians, one of whom was a lawyer, talking about the Cass report, which is this famous report that came out of Great Britain by Hilary Cass, who is the chief pediatrician for the whole country. She's knighted
for the health
and
service,
all this.
National Health.
Yeah, and came out and said, no more puberty blockers. These treatments don't help children at all, and they shouldn't be employed in children. And these two physicians, again, writing in the most prestigious journal, said, well, first of all, they didn't agree with the report because the report was not peer-reviewed, but she was given an official designation as being the one who was going to be the key reviewer. They said there weren't any experts in the field who wrote this report, but that's the whole point of doing an independent analysis. If you have people who are treating these kids, they're going to be, with gendered treatments, they're going to be advocates for their treatment, so you're not getting an independent review. And then they said, well, they demand clinical studies that the Cass report said there were no controlled clinical trials, and that you can't really do clinical trials. And there are lots of examples in pediatric medicine where off-label drugs, as they're used as off-label, the hormones and puberty blockers in this condition, are used in order to treat conditions. And all of these arguments are ridiculous. I mentioned about the peer review. I mentioned about the experts. You need to have independence, not experts who are compromised. And finally, when you use off-label drugs to treat a child with leukemia, you're trying to save their life. When you use off-label hormones to change a child's physical appearance, you're not treating their condition, because we know their condition doesn't benefit from this treatment. all you're doing is putting that child at great risk. So it's one thing to use drugs in a desperate effort to try to save a child's life or to treat a known condition. It's another thing to make up a treatment that you have no evidence is beneficial and yet still apply drugs that you know have tremendous side effects. So this is the problem in American medicine, to answer your question. They've decided to go down the path of trying to resist at every step along the way the scientific evidence that shows that these treatments should not be applied to children and that they can't make informed consent about these treatments and that these treatments don't change the underlying condition, don't lead to better health outcomes, don't lead to psychological improvements, and yet they persist in doing it. And unlike the European countries that have very centralized healthcare systems that can shut something like this down, not something that we want in America, by the way, but they are effective in shutting down a treatment that clearly doesn't work after they looked at their own experience. In this country, every physician who has an MD and a license to practice medicine can treat anybody the way they want. And therefore, it's a condition that really is out of control in that sense. The real problem in this country is the professional medical societies have also been tremendously compromised and have not been willing to control these treatments and recommend to their members that this is not the right way to practice medicine. So we're not only fighting against all these individual physicians who have taken this up, but also the medical societies who have become, captured by activists who push this agenda on them.
Is this ultimately, is RFK Jr. right? Is this an acquiescence to the drug companies and the clinics, the transgender clinics that have proliferated around the country, and of course our profit centers? And is there anything that RFK can do via Trump to shut some of this stuff down?
Well, I think what they can do is they can stop having it being funded through Medicaid. Medicaid, funds child health care to a great extent, and they could shut it down on that basis. I don't quite know all the steps that would have to be pursued in terms of the actual legalities of that sort of thing. That's what they could do. Again, it's medicine is predominantly regulated at the state level. That's why there are bills in 26 or 28 states now that have been implemented to prevent this kind of gender care. But then there are a bunch of states like New York and California. California has a law that says if the parents don't want to support gender transition, the kids can be taken over by the state and put through these gender treatments without the parents having anything to do with the care of their child. I mean, California is way out there in sort of supporting this and in ways that are crazy.
Nonsensical. It's an ideological belief. I mean, if you go, there are some advocates now I've read that just think that every child should have puberty blockers, and then they can decide if they want to go through puberty. I mean, that's the end game there. If you really believe that your sex is assigned at birth, that you're not born male or female, then let's make it. I don't think that will sell. I mean, I think after the COVID vaccine, I think people would be turning down puberty blockers for every kid. But what worries, as we wrap up here, what worries you most? Or are you not worried? Are you just optimistic about America's beginning to see the light here? And
well, let me say this. I think I've had a chance to talk with some of the people who are coming in to run the Trump agenda,
oh, good.
And the thing that they're worried about the most is sort of the thing that Republicans have been successful at, which is using the legal system to block these reforms. And they're worried that the courts will become the venue where these issues are played out, and that we have a judicial system that is chosen by politicians. Basically, the Biden administration picked, I think, 235 federal judges. The Trump administration before them picked 250 some odd federal judges. So sort of depends on what venue you're in, how these decisions are going to go. So that's the biggest concern, because as you said before, a lot of these proposals that have come out of DEI and have come out of the gender ideology are sort of crazy and ridiculous and lack merit and lack scientific basis. And yet, when they get in the judicial system, we're going to see the fights go on. And this Supreme Court case, the Scarametti case versus the United States, which was argued
tell us about that.
about a month ago. Well,
details
that
of
was a case. It's the law in Tennessee. Tennessee passed a law blocking gender-affirming care, and organizations, a bunch of different organizations, mostly supporting transgender sort of ideology, came out and opposed it. And their argument was, and it's sort of a goofy argument, but legally it may have some weight, was that, well, if a boy comes in and asks for testosterone treatments because he has low testosterone levels, you give it to him. If a girl comes in and asks for testosterone treatments, the law says you can't give it to them because it's trying to change their gender. They're seeing that as a sex discrimination case. And this was the argument. This was the most, important argument that was made, and that based on the 14th Amendment, there's an equal protection problem here because one group of individuals is being denied while another group of individuals is being allowed, and it's based on sex. Mm-hmm. That may sound a little crazy to the audience, but it may have legal power, and we'll see. But that was basically the case, that the Tennessee law that blocked any of these transition treatments for kids with gender dysphoria, the government was saying was illegal, and the state of Tennessee was saying should be sustained. That case the verdict will be announced, I guess, in June at the end of the Supreme Court term, and we will then find out. If that case goes against Tennessee and makes that law not sustainable, I think we're in for a big mess, because then there's just going to be more of these lawsuits, and any state that has such a law will be prohibited from maintaining that law. So I think that'll be a key decision. But I think that if you ask what's worrying me is all these initiatives, reforms that are really important that the Trump administration has started down the path, and Texas has started down the path of, will be the subject of lawsuits and will be great delays in ever getting anything implemented.
Yeah, and just a lot of frustration, but a lot of hope too.
Yes,
I mean, the fact that this is being, I expect to see changes culturally, and a lot of the big transformations that we're seeing now are changes in the culture, changes in music, changes in art, changes in theater. I say this knowing that we've got a trans person nominated for Best Actress this time,
yes,
for the first time. But as you say, it's not that we want no trans people to exist. It's just that we don't want these procedures performed on children.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Dr. Goldfarb, great to have you. So glad you're in Texas. I know you're going to be at the University of Austin later today,
yes,
and looking forward to hearing you there. Thank you all for joining us at the Sherry Sylvester Show. You can subscribe to the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on X at Sylvester1630, and if you'd like to receive the 9th in Congress newsletter, including my weekly winners and losers list, you can sign up at the TPPF website, www.texaspolicy.com/9th in Congress. See you next time.